Thank you for the very nice intro, and thanks for speakers and everybody who has already talked, and to the organizers of the event. This is my first time in Vancouver, and this is actually wrapping up the tail end of what I've been calling my Grand Canadian Tour. I was in Toronto a few weeks ago, and then I was in Montreal, which is the second time that I visited, and now I'm rounding it out in Vancouver, so I feel a little bit like kind of David Hasselhoff, like I'm really big in Germany for whatever reason. So, thank you. So my talk here is called Indie Around the World, and then I have a very exciting subtitle called The Future of Indie. And I kind of want to preface this a little bit with saying, these are based on my personal experiences and traveling and events that we've done kind of globally, and just talking a little bit about all these different places. I'm not trying to say like I fully understand the kind of like cultural and historical background of every country that I'm talking about, but so take all of this as kind of just a personal experience. All right, so who am I? My name is Kelly Wallick, and as I was introduced before, I'm the CEO and founder of the Indie Mega Booth. I'm the chairman of the IGF, and a co-organizer of Bit Summit, which is in Kyoto, Japan. So all three of these roles focus on highlighting content in the independent game scene with a focus on local and global community building. So I have a little bit here of the kind of like types of communities that I've managed, places that I've worked in the past. You can see the picture underneath is obviously not when I was working in video games. In my previous life, I worked as a chemist, so that was what I went to school for, and I worked in that industry for about 5 years before moving into the games industry. I was focused a lot on lab management and experiment design, which surprisingly has a lot more overlap with what I'm doing now than it would kind of seem like. For a little while I was working at a chemical engineering lab at MIT, and a lot of the students that I worked with there, I think remind me a lot of independent developers and what I like about working in this community. It's people who are very entrepreneurial, they're really intelligent, they're very creative, they're very technical, and they're all kind of a little weird. So when I first started getting into indie games, I kind of felt like I had found my people and found my community. So it's become a really important part of my life. So first I'm going to kind of summarize a little bit of where we've done shows, where I've traveled before, where my experience is coming from. A little bit of personal background also. I was raised in a military family, which means that we moved around a lot. So I was actually born in Japan, but hadn't had a chance to go back there until started doing work there when I got a bit older. Lived kind of all over the United States, and so I'm used to being a little kind of like transient and traveling a lot. When my parents got divorced, we didn't have money, so I stopped traveling for a long time. And then when I started up the Mega Booth, I took the opportunity to essentially just kind of travel as much as possible. So I've really integrated it into the work that I do on purpose because it was something that I enjoyed. So we primarily run shows in the US, which is where I'm based out of. So you can see here we do shows at PAX East, which is in Boston. We do a small showcase at GDC, which is in San Francisco. We do PAX West, which is Seattle. We started new events this year that are called the Mega Show, which are standalone events that are focused on music and art and games, and kind of trying to bridge kind of the physical-digital divide, I guess, between communities and start to growing our own consumer base. And then we've also run a lot of off-site E3 events as well, too. And then shows that we've done in Europe, so we did a showcase at Gamescom. We also did one at EGX. And then, as I mentioned, we co-organize Bit Summit, which is going on, I think we've organized it for 3 years, so this will be going on the 4th year. We did a showcase at Taipei Game Developers Forum, and then in a couple days I'm going to be heading out to Shanghai for an event called We Play China, which is organized by an indie publisher out of China that we've been working with over the last few years. So places that I've traveled specifically for doing speaking events or doing community organizing. Like I said, I was kind of building it into my travel schedule, so a lot of times I'd like to go and visit countries where there seems to be emerging communities, or there's kind of some interesting stuff going on, and meeting with people, spending some time there and learning a little bit about what they're working on and what their challenges are. So I don't know if I should read all of these off, but You can see here there's a handful of countries in Europe, a little bit in Asia, Japan, China, Taiwan. Went to South Africa and spent some time there for about like a month or so. Obviously kind of like all over the US, a little bit in Germany and stuff as well too. So I'm primarily going to be focusing on these couple regions here because they're the ones that I'm sort of the most familiar with. You'll notice here what the regions that are kind of missing are like Mexico, South America, Middle East, and then kind of like, you know, greater African content outside of South Africa. There's actually a lot of kind of consumer demand and content and stuff coming out of Mexico and South America, and so that's something that we're hoping to work towards in the future. We've been talking with communities and stuff there on and off for the last year or so. So that's something that we kind of hope to be expanding into. And then Australia, unfortunately, I've never actually gotten to visit there, but for reasons that I'll get into a little bit here, we had a pretty high volume of people from Australia coming and showing video games at the Mega Booth with us. I've had lots of conversations with people from there, so I feel pretty comfortable at least explaining a little bit about what's happening in Australia. All right, well, America. I have a really hard time not putting like any political pictures in this, so I'm just gonna stick to the facts here. All right, so America, everyone's favorite country. So one of the things that I think is kind of surprising, or maybe not so surprising for people outside of the US, is that there's essentially no government funding for like arts programs. I mean, they're there, but they're kind of primarily around like really heavy academic institutions or things that are already kind of like established. And so the idea of getting like some sort of public funding or an arts grant for doing a video game in the US is essentially non-existent. On the alternative side, because we have capitalism and that's great, we have a really high level of private investment. So there's tons of VC money, there's lots of investments, there's lots of funds, there's angel investors. There's just tons of kind of money floating around in there. So it's kind of the, do you have to write grants and kind of go that route, or do you have to like wine and dine VCs and get money that way? Another thing is that it's very easy to start a company. The US has a really high entrepreneurial rate. When I was living in Boston, I think Boston has the highest entrepreneurial rate in the country. So basically, everyone and their mom is running a company there. You can just fill out a form on the internet and there you go. The kind of weird other side of this, and you also have the on-demand economy and all other sort of stuff, is that we don't really have a lot of good social supports. Health insurance is really difficult. And so there's a kind of high risk when you fail, that you could fail pretty hard because there's not really a safety net underneath you. A lot of the communities are based around major cities, and this tends to be kind of East Coast, West Coast. The West Coast is a lot more tech-based, so you think like Seattle, San Francisco, that whole thing. And then on the East Coast, it's a little more kind of like money, business, politics, but there's some really big communities around in like Boston, DC, New York. There's a variety of other places, but they tend to be kind of concentrated on the coast and around major cities. So Canada. I'm not gonna talk too much about Canada since you are all in Canada and I don't want to lecture you on your own country. But as I mentioned, spent some time doing some work in Toronto at the Hand-Eye Society. Spent some time in Montreal, did the stuff here. So part of the thing that I find interesting with Canada is it's kind of a good mix on the things that the US is missing, where you have things like the Canadian Media Fund, you have access to public funding, you have these kind of like arts initiatives that you can work towards with video game content, and you also have some access to private investment. You also have good social support networks, like everybody has access to health insurance, and so there's ways that it kind of makes it easy, or easier in some ways, to be able to take a little bit more risk in the kind of content and games that you're making. One of the reasons that I was in Montreal is that there was an academic symposium with the university that we've been working with there that's been doing research on the Mega Booth and game communities and what they're calling cultural intermediaries. There's a lot of really interesting discussions and interesting research going on, and got to learn a lot about kind of how the Canadian, game and tech structure works. So, well done, Canada. So then Europe, on the other hand, has actually pretty high government funding and a lot of arts fundings and grants, and this is obviously dependent on country specific. They have really high social support, good education system, good health insurance. What this kind of does in a kind of utopian way is that there's a pretty big high art scene, especially when you get into Scandinavian countries like Denmark, where you can just kind of make games because you want to make a game, where it's based around university funding. And the side effect of this is that a lot of the games don't necessarily need to be commercially viable because they don't have to have some like specific return on investment tied into it, or they don't have to like make a certain amount of money. And then to further kind of like take that one step more is that what that means is that a lot of the companies that we work with to get sponsorship for the Mega Booth, which is how we financially support ourselves, don't really have the same kind of marketing budgets as they do in the US or they do in Asia, because a lot of times when something is marketed in the US, it just kind of like trickles down out into Europe. And so it's actually been really cost prohibitive for us to actually do a lot of showcases and do work in Europe. But there's tons of like really amazing, cool festivals like the Amaze festivals in Berlin. There's a bunch of really cool stuff going on in Paris, and a lot of those are more around kind of like art and culture and play and games, less so than I think that there is in the West. So then going into kind of regions in Asia, so this is primarily, I'm talking about Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. There's actually a lot of like government-specific funding for video games. Like we went, I gave a talk at Busan Indie Connect, which is in South Korea, and the event was actually held in the government building for video games and manga comics. And it was like a whole building that the government owned and government employees worked in it, and the government funded like the entire first event, which is something that just totally blew my mind. For Bit Summit, we get some funding from like the Kyoto local prefect to help out with it, and I think that there's kind of an understanding and a culture around like games being their own kind of specific thing that are important culturally in some way. And so Korea, China, Taiwan, like all of those have like really high kind of like game culture around them, and I think that the scenes there are growing pretty quickly. Japan, as much as like we're doing work there, the growth is actually a little slow, and it's kind of inhibited a bit by like the social norms around it. Like as cool as it is to like drop out of your life and like become an artist and make indie games, like that's not a socially acceptable thing to do in Japan. So even though that's where a lot of like in my mind, like video games come from Japan, like that's where like, you know, this is where it was all kind of initially created. It's kind of like shifted to like these bigger companies that are more stable and more safe. And as the indie scene is growing, we're trying to help to kind of like introduce teams there and people and the government and companies that we work with to the concept of being able to start something entrepreneurial and start something small and still have it be like a respectful or, you know, a respectable way to make a living. There's been a lot of interest from China on games from the West, especially, you know, things like Tencent has a new platform that is kind of like a Steam competitor, I guess I would say. And there's a lot of money flying around in it, and so there's been a lot of interest from Chinese companies, and there's a lot of companies in Japan that do this as well to help bring games from the West to the East and vice versa. There can be a lot of like restrictions around like getting approval from government and bureaucracy and translation issues, and so there's a whole kind of like little like subculture of industries that have cropped up that are people that specifically kind of bridge the gap between the two sides of the world to be able to help bring content in and out. And that's primarily how we've met a lot of people that we started working with, is there's always kind of like the one team or the one company or the one publisher that like manages to like get to a show in the West and comes and like talks with us and then can help with translation for like bringing people over from Korea. So like we've worked with the Busan Indie Connect folks a bunch, and so we organized with them specifically because of the language barrier, because of the cultural differences, and so a lot of that's making that possible, I think, and easier now for people to put their games into these markets in ways that are a lot easier and cheaper than they were in the past. So a little bit on South Africa, which I think has been a pretty like strong, growing community. It started off sort of with the Desktop Dungeon team is based out of there, and then the people who made Broforce are from there as well. Ben Myers, who does the curation for Amaze in Johannesburg, had a kind of like really interesting point of view on this, where he's like, a lot of South African games are essentially parroting America and our culture and then selling it back to us, which I think actually happens a lot more than we realize it is. So one of the good things with doing work in South Africa is that the cost of living is very low comparatively to the rest of the world. But then your local resources are actually really low, like the infrastructure is not super great. There's a lot of hurdles, like there's issues with getting visas, there's problems with like banking and getting money in and out of the country. And so even though it's growing, it's kind of like hindered in some way by how far away South Africa was from everything, you know, until the apartheid ended. And then finally, I'm gonna, like I said, talk a little bit about Australia. So the thing with Australia is that initially there was a lot of really big contract shops that would work for AAA companies in the US. And then when we went through the recession in 2008, a lot of those companies ended up collapsing like a year or two later because they weren't getting the same kind of contract work that they used to. And so around like 2009, 2010 is when a lot of kind of like indie studios started cropping up in Australia because there were tons of people who were very qualified, who had worked at these big companies that now were, out of business. So there's a pretty big indie scene there, and then for a while the Australian government was actually funding, like paying for people to take flights to go to conferences outside of Australia so that they could promote games and culture and stuff coming from Australia as well. The last I kind of heard, I don't think that they do it anymore. There was so for a long time we had like tons of Australian developers in the mega booth because if they would get accepted, then the government would pay for them to come out. And then one year there was like some sort of hiccup with it and we lost like 7 games or something. It was like a really big number of people. But I think that there's a lot of work that a lot of people are doing to help to keep that going, like keep programs like that happening. I think there's a lot of really interesting, like cool stuff coming out of Australia. So despite all of these differences, there's definitely kind of like common, issues or concerns that go globally all around the world. So the number one thing would definitely be funding, like regardless of the fact that like, it's so great that there's like grants or art programs, then you still have to write the grant. You still have to know how that stuff works. You still have to compete with tons of other people for it. Do you get your game funded by a publisher or do you try and bootstrap it? Do you take on investment or do you take on a loan? Are you self-financed or like what I'm calling silent support, which I think is actually very prevalent in the indie scene and not really talked about too much, is people who are supported by their spouses or by their family or by some sort of like money that they had in the past in some ways. And so what ends up happening is that kind of creates a cycle where like the people who are able to start and make and create games have already come from a situation where they had money in the first place. And so I think that that's really one of the kind of biggest issues, limiting like our ability to increase diversity in the games industry and tech in general. And then obviously discoverability, like if I finally got money and I was able to make my game, like how the hell does anybody find my game? And so there's a lot of platforms and all these different like things that are kind of cropping up. I think for indie developers, grassroots marketing is still probably the most common and most effective, and that can be anything from the topics that were touched on in the last talk, to going to a bunch of different shows. You kind of run the conference circuit, doing things like finding your niche community and marketing to them specifically. And then that kind of feeds into a little bit with like tastemakers, YouTubers, streamers. It's like if you can get someone who has a really large audience of the type of people who want to play your game, then obviously like they'll be able to find that content. And then access to resources or networks. So like, where are these networks coming from? Where are these resources coming from? And this kind of ties a little bit into the funding stuff as well too, is like, if you need certain resources to get your game to where you want to be and you have to run in certain circles or you have to like look a certain way or act a certain way or drink a certain amount of alcohol or something, it's going to like limit the ability for new people to come into these industries. One of the things that I think has made the mega booths successful, or one of the things that I think people like about it, is that we try to kind of like give people access to these resources and networks without having to like jump through all these like bizarro hurdles of like cornering the one person that they know at the party that's from like a really important platform for them to talk to. Like we organize events like that. We help to curate for like the platform holders and for the games, and I think that that's been something that's really important, is kind of like teaching people how to reach these networks and how to talk to people and how to network and how to like make their games reach the audience that they want to. And then, so things like the cultural divide or crossover, like how do I get my game to a market where it might be really good? Like you could have a game that maybe doesn't do really well in the US and Canada, but it's like a giant hit in Russia or something, or like it would be really good for players in another country. Like how do you get your game into there and how do you understand what's happening with it? And then community support and building it's not really like an issue, but I think that's probably one of the single most important things that can happen in an area for making developers successful, is to have a support group and to have a community that's built around it, which is why there's a lot of like, cities that these things are concentrated around. And so I think like there's Tokyo Indies, which is actually started by a guy who used to live in Boston who moved to Tokyo and then was like, why are there no game meetups? So he just made an indie game meetup, and now there's like, this kind of community and cultural hub around that. Even though it's been run by an expat, it still kind of like mixes between all these different people. And so we also do that as well too when we're curating for the mega booth. It's like, if we see that someone is like making games in Kansas, we're like, oh my God, come and talk to other people, like learn from them, and then come back and like bring these ideas back to your community so that you can help to like build an infrastructure so people can be successful. Oh, and then the big question is sustainability. Like, how does it stay sustainable in the long run? I think one of my favorite kind of dream ideas is that the funding style starts to go a little more like patron of the arts style, and not so much like, I mean, Kickstarter and Patreon is a little bit like that, but it's like a crowdsourced version of it. But I mean, like, truly just people who have too much money that don't know what to do with it, just supporting things that should be happening because they're culturally important. It happens in lots of other mediums, and it doesn't happen in games. And I think that if we can move into a model that's like that, that could actually help solve a lot of these problems. Also kind of investments, you know, increasing government funding in places that don't really have it, or like in the case of Europe, a lot of European grants are under the guise of being like art or film or media or something in some ways, and kind of moving more in the model like how Asia has, where it's like, no, like tech and games are like their own distinct kind of thing that should have its own funding. It doesn't have to like pretend that it's also a movie just because there's like moving images on a screen. And then also creating more social support. So even if like there's not social supports within a certain country or a certain you know, state or whatever, is to make those within your own community so that people will have ways that they can kind of like safely fail. All right, so what are some small and big solutions to this whole situation? So one of my favorite quotes is that all politics is local. And what that means is that you see big kind of global national problems and you're like, oh my God, how is that problem ever gonna get solved? Like, this is such a huge issue. The answer is like, you don't solve that problem. What you do is you organize and you solve small problems within your immediate community. Like, everything in that community can move very fast. Like, local elections happen very quickly. You know, people can get angry and they just go out on the streets and they do whatever. And those movements are what pushes the kind of national conversation forward, and then that's what pushes global conversations forward. And so I think it can be easy to become really paralyzed by like the scope of what the issues are, and really you shouldn't be looking at solving the big issue, you should be looking at solving the very tiny immediate issues that you can see within your own community. And the more that you do that, and the more people that you affect, then that kind of will like propagate outward. So things like starting programs, the Hand-Eye Society thing that I was working with them on was to help to train indie developers on how to do biz dev, or like how to learn basic marketing techniques. I think there's developers in Vancouver starting like an elementary school. You know, doing outreach in your local community, these can have like really long-standing effects to solve these really big problems. And if you think about it, the way that tech influences the world, I think, is a lot more prevalent than what people are giving it credit for. And there's a lot of conversations around this, like things like Facebook and Twitter are started in San Francisco. You know, what if Facebook had been developed by someone who lived in India, or someone who came from, I don't know, China or something? You know, like, how would all of our global and national conversations be different if they've been created by different people? And so I think that there's a lot more power in what we create than we were giving ourselves credit for. I think that I'm happy that this is getting talked about a bit more, but also like the importance of increasing just diversity in general. And I'm not just talking like gender diversity, but also like racial diversity, and also like sexual diversity, and also class diversity, which I think is a really, really big issue. And one of the things that helps to make this happen in a kind of like small way is the importance of having role models. And you don't have to be like a perfect person to be a role model. One of the most influential and important people in my life was my chemistry teacher when I was in high school. And she was just like weird and lived on a farm and like made her own soaps and aspirin, and like she was married and was having a kid, but like it wasn't her whole life, and she like did all this kind of like cool, interesting stuff. And like I didn't have this like great personal relationship with her. It's not like I hung out there all the time and like we had all these great conversations, but just the fact that she existed as a person gave me inspiration to be like, oh my God, I could do that too, or that could be me. And so if you have all this content and all these creators who all kind of like look the same, and you can't see yourself reflected in the possibility of what you could be in the future, then it's going to be much harder for you to get involved in something. It's going to be much harder for you to make your own path. And so I think just living your life and doing the things that you want to do and being visible and saying like, hey, you know, I'm doing it, sometimes it sucks, but also you can do it too, I think is a really important way to help to increase diversity and solve some of these problems that seem to just kind of be, you know, global issues. I was just like throwing this in here. These next two slides, I'm just putting in every talk that I ever give. So I think the issue of burnout is definitely like cross-cultural. Like that is not just, you know, in this country or just in one country or whatever. Especially I think people who tend to be entrepreneurial, people who work in tech, people who are self-starters. You have, you know, personality traits that lead into like workaholism and perfectionism and all the other isms that you want to throw in there. And in some ways it's also kind of like encouraged and like fetishized in some way where it's like, oh my god, I work so much and I only sleep 3 hours a day. And I was saying this in another talk, like sleep deprivation is like a literal form of torture. Like they do it to torture people, you should sleep. Like get sleep at night. Get sleep and drink water are like the two big things that you should do as a human being. That's my advice, drink water and get some sleep. But it's real, and like in the burnout can really destroy your productivity. Like the idea of working an 8-hour workday was something that Henry Ford had researched to see how long it took before people got too physically tired to produce cars at the same rate. Like you're not meant to do mental work in the same way. There's been studies that it says like 6 hours or maybe 4 hours after you have lunch or before you start to get mentally fatigued on what you're working on. So the idea of like sitting in front of a computer working for 12 or 15 or 16 or 18 hours or something is kind of like, it's, you know, craziness in some way. Like how much are you actually producing and what space do you have left to be creative if you're just like producing. The emotional labor side of it, I think like that's, and I mean, community leaders I think get this a lot. I think it also kind of ends up being gendered in some way because there's this like not a really high number of women in the games industry in general and in tech in general, and so I think that, or at least from my personal experience, I get a lot of like guys who are like, oh my god, I have someone to talk to about my emotions too, and then they just dump like everything on you, and you're like, you need a therapist, like don't come and tell me these big giant problems, like I want to help you, but like, oh my god. So I think it's something to be aware of, is like, you know, you don't have to take on everybody's problems to solve the kind of big problems, which leads into my second favorite slide, which is boundaries. And this is, I mean, I'm giving this advice as if I'm really good at it. Like I'm not really great at avoiding burnout, I'm not really great at having boundaries. But it's something that's really important to set, especially in a digital age. Like I don't have notifications on my phone essentially, unless for ways for people to personally get in touch with me, like my friends and my family and my loved ones. Like I don't like being messaged on Facebook, you know, to like have someone ask a question about something, because it's like Facebook is a social site, it's not where I work. And the idea that like you have to constantly be like reacting to things, and you have to be on Twitter, and you have to do this, and you have to be hustling, like, you know, you have to put some limit on when and how that is happening, or you're just gonna drive yourself crazy. So now that I've gone on my little kind of like personal voyage rant, so just a couple thoughts on kind of like, you know, what is the future of indie, or kind of like where do I see things going based on all these conversations and all the companies and stuff that we've worked with. I think hopefully we're going to be moving into more stable funding models. I think there's a lot of really smart people who are working really hard on this, and there's a lot of people that recognize that this is an issue. I think there's going to be more actual diversity in the creators and the content. I think the indie scene is kind of a microcosm of what's going to be happening in the larger tech scene. Like even just from when I started in this 6 years ago, you know, the number of women that I see, the number of people of color, the number of like LGBTQ community, people, you know, from all over the world who are getting involved in games and in tech is increasing. And so I think that we can be the kind of like, I guess, role model for the larger like tech industry, and I see that being really important, not just for content and the creators, but also just for kind of like the world overall, so that like the same people aren't making the same things. One of the things that I found really interesting in studying the music industry is that there's this idea that like, you know, how are people making money off of music? And I think it kind of mirrors the games industry a lot. And there's a bunch of studies where it's like there's still the same amount of money in music, it's just not concentrated in the same way. So there's kind of less of like the super mega stars, you know, like Madonna or something, who's just like dominating the charts and making all the money, and there's 3 or 4 of those. Now there's like maybe 1 or maybe 2 of those, and then there's more money in the middle. And so there's a lot more kind of niche audiences, and audiences that are able to be directly connected with each other through things like Spotify or festivals or YouTube. And at the academic symposium that I was at, additional research has found that like they're not even really making money off selling the music so much as they are selling the kind of like experience and culture around the music that they're creating and around their community. There's a kind of cool article that's like you just need 1,000 super fans, and I think that the easiest way to make more sustainable games is to find your audience and just be able to connect with them and stop worrying about like trying to connect with every single person and just kind of like, you know, doing the bullet spray out there and just seeing what sticks. Another thing I think is really going to take off is alternative controller games, arcades, VR. That whole idea, like the idea of play and fun and having physical experiences, I think as we move more digital, that idea is going to become more interesting to people. And I think it also helps to bridge the gap between getting your games marketed to people who maybe aren't hanging out on Steam all day, or they're not reading Polygon or whatever, they're just like hanging out and doing normal people things. So if you have like an arcade or a VR arcade, or you have cool alternative stuff or whatever, that will draw in an audience of people who probably would love your stuff but would never discover it in any other way. So I think even though there's a lot of not great things that are going on in tech or in the world in general, like I feel very positive about the way that we're moving forward. I think, especially in the last year or so, people have really kind of buckled down and been like, there's some real serious, deep problems, and like there's got to be real serious, long-term solutions. And some of these are probably going to be things, like I said, out of our control, like stuff like a universal basic income would solve, 80% of this problem. So it's things that I think is a kind of like, as a society and globally and all this stuff, as we connect with each other and talk to each other, as like, oh, that's how it works in your country, or oh, that's what you do, and oh, you do this, and like, that's one of the biggest pieces of power that you can have, is communicating with other people and learning from them and learning how to move forward. And I think that is happening despite the fact that like a lot of times a lot of stuff feels like shit. So I think it's actually going to be positive in the future, and I think we're moving in a good direction. So that's my version of the future of independent game development. And then that is my talk, and that is my contact info.